Our first chief speaker, Dr. Vicky Ginn, graduated as a Doctor of Philosophy and Archaeology from Queen's University in Belfast. She is currently, if I've got it right, Inspector of Archaeological Monuments. Okay, thank you. In the Historic Environment Division of the Department of Communities. Dr. Ginn will give us an overview of the Bronze Age village at Corrstown and examine how new archaeological discoveries and scientific methods are being used to compare Corrstown to contemporary settlements in Bronze Age Ireland and Britain. Dr. Ginn, okay.
Thanks very much, John. I am very impressed at this well-oiled machine and the turnout, and also somewhat intimidated. So bear with me. So I don't often get to wear my Corrstown hat. It's been a long time, not quite 20 years, but almost, since I've got to wear the Corrstown hat. Yes, as John says, I now work for Historic Environment Division, and I'm in the Scheduled Monuments Management team as well. So if you have any general archaeological or heritage questions, feel free to fire me those at the end too. I'm here in multiple guises tonight. So in a former life, I worked with archaeological consultancy services, studying archives and writing reports and publications. And one such archive was that of Corrstown, excavated just over 20 years ago now by Mal Conway, who is now with the National Trust, and Audrey Gahan, who is now with Gahan and Long. When the site was excavated, I was in university in England. So I was never actually on the site myself, although I did pore over the archive material for months and months. There was a time when I lived, breathed and dreamt Corrstown context numbers and structure numbers, and and cobbled numbers of cobble surfaces as well. So I have a familial relationship and association with Portrush. My mum grew up a stone's throw from the site, and I spent many a summer and winter visiting my grandparents here. So when we talk about why Corrstown developed here, what made the North Coast so attractive, I find it hard to separate my archaeologist's brain from my own love of the area. Why would you not want to live here? And I think if I lived in Bronze Age Ireland, I would definitely want to live in Philip Armstrong's picture. So tonight I'm going to provide a wee bit of a background on the site. And then Kerri is going to explain how she has been taking the research forward. It's largely Kerri carrying the mantle. As I say, it's been a long time since I've had my Corrstown hat on. But this is what it looked like when it was excavated. So north is to the top. We've got Hopefield Avenue running along here and Macramina to the left. We have 76 roundhouses. There were approximately 50 of them that we think were broadly contemporary. Most of the houses kind of existed on little platforms, and you can kind of see some segmented ditches around them. So a lot of them had very well defined porches as well, and we'll see a wee picture of one of those later on. So the people of Corrstown also rebuilt a lot of their houses on the same platform, sometimes several times over. We also have a two-tiered road network that you can't really see on this aerial photograph, but Philip has captured it so impressively in one of his illustrations over there. So this as well, it's important to note, is not the full extent of the settlement. You used to be able to, for context, this is Corrstown now, and you used to be able to see similar circular crop marks over here and to the west. So we know when the Macramina housing development was excavated with one or two houses there as well. So we don't know the full extent, but it could have been a lot bigger. And this is where my mum grew up, right down here at the end of Hopefield Avenue. And she regularly found flint artefacts and things in her garden, and I'm sure she wasn't the only one in the area as well. So we don't know if that was related, but it's nice to pretend that it is. So we have this profusion of contemporary dwellings. And this is what really makes it the defining characteristic of why Corrstown is so important. So 20 years on, the site remains unique in Britain and Ireland. No other site comes anywhere near close in terms of the sheer number of contemporary structures. We know this because there's been a massive upsurge since this site was excavated in 2002, 2003, in housing developments, motorway junctions, massive motorway interchanges. They've all been archaeologically excavated, all those massive motorways down south, and we've nothing akin to Corrstown has turned up yet. So this map shows us the distribution of Bronze Age settlement in Ireland. So you can clearly see that we have a lot of evidence to compare with Corrstown. We've discovered an awful lot of other Bronze Age sites. So to put the village life of Corrstown in context, elsewhere in Bronze Age Ireland, most people generally lived in a wee settlement, maybe a couple of houses, an annex, maybe a hamlet at best. So you might have had one or two from Philip's lovely illustrations, but certainly not anywhere near 50. So this site in Screen 3 in County Meath, is quite typical of what we would see elsewhere in Ireland. So it's a domestic site. It's got two phases. We've got a house and an enclosure, and then a second house, and it's enclosed, and some of these field systems are associated with it. So this type of house probably would only really have supported one kin group or family. And from about the Middle Bronze Age, approximately 1500 BC, people seem to become a wee bit more attached to where they lived than perhaps they did previously, or perhaps that we can discern in the archaeological record. Fences and enclosures emerge alongside the rebuilding of houses, and there's a bit of a trend to committing to a particular place that is perceived as good for settlement. And we can see that very much here in structure 15 from Corrstown. So we get this post-hole clustering that you can see quite clearly defined, and this tells us that the posts were replaced on multiple occasions. So large construction posts like these would have been made from oak, and they would have lasted 20 or 30 years or so, depending on the ground conditions. So this gives us a really good indication that these houses were rebuilt when they needed. And so this can also tell us that these houses were most likely occupied for several generations. And overall, people in Bronze Age Ireland were generally self-sufficient. This is something Kerri will come back to. They produced their own food and most of their own materials that they needed, like knapping their own flint or using local clays to make their pots. Everyday household items kind of formed the mainstay of associated assemblages that we have excavated from these sites. There was maybe the odd little bit of low-level trading that seemed to go on, maybe for a metal axe head or a hair ring or a bead. But they were generally kind of farmers, self-sufficient. And all these little settlements were generally quite dispersed. We go back to our map here. But they certainly weren't isolated. They were often enclosed and defined as individual units, but they were maybe only 1 or 2 kilometres away from their neighbours. They might have shared social spaces at other sites, such as their cemeteries or burnt mound sites. But this pattern of relative dispersal, you can see it's kind of repeated across Ireland. And we have this social model where people's identity was very much associated with where they lived, but it was very much associated with that kind of individual level. And it was shared and reinforced through kin groups and through those that they maybe encountered in different spheres of daily life. So we can see here on this map that we have a handful of sites. There's really not that many where you would have got more than a couple of houses that we know were contemporary. So we've got, interestingly, quite a few in the north. We've got big sites up at Knockdhu. White Park Bay, antiquarian accounts kind of suggest that there was several houses at White Park Bay, and the remains of some of them are still there, kind of right up close to the sand dunes. We know that there were at least 10 Middle Bronze Age houses down here in Tipperary, a couple of other sites down Tipperary as well. Some of the hill fort sites as well have now also been found to have significant numbers of houses, but none of these even come close to what we have at Corrstown. So what is the crack with Corrstown? How did it develop? When did it develop? And why? Why is it so different from everywhere else? Well, Cormac McSparren from Queen's, he worked with us to analyse the radiocarbon dates that we got from the site. And we don't need to go into too much technical detail here, but it's important to note that he identified 3 phases: a growth phase, when the site began and was developing, a village phase, when it was at its zenith, and a decline phase. And because Corrstown is pretty much unique in this prehistoric context, there hasn't been much research done into how villages developed in a similar context. But instead, we can look to what medieval archaeologists and medieval historians have thought about the development of villages then, and we can draw some useful parallels at that. So at Corrstown, we kind of believe, or Stuart and I, who I wrote the book with, had chatted about the possibility of structure 19 being a bit of a founding structure. It was the only house within the site to have an additional ditch, which you can see here. And at the time, we thought it could well represent the origin of Corrstown. We then thought that it was possible the growth phase was caused by some sort of imperceptible shift. The addition of a couple of extra houses around Structure 19 maybe led to a chain reaction with considerable consequences for the whole settlement. The site continued to develop and grow, and there's no evidence for a boundary or edges. As I say, it probably extended quite far, though there was a stream to the west, which acted as some kind of natural barrier here. So medieval settlement morphologists, they have suggested that this process of conglomeration, this nucleation that develops, is often followed by replanning of the settlement, and that then they would replan the settlement and put houses in grid patterns, kind of maybe in accordance of an ideal of what a village should look like. And you can see that quite clearly in a lot of planned villages and planned towns like New York, and you get the block formation. But we have evidence here at Corrstown. And I know you can draw lines through anything, but when you do draw these lines, it looks really, really convincing that you have these roughly east-west houses, this kind of north-south alignment here going on. That there's some semblance, there's something going on here, there's some level of planned activity or planned structure to the site. And we also have evidence that the entrances to the houses were deliberately modified, and they were done in such a way that the road surface was recobbled to kind of take all of this into account. So there was obviously some level of planning and coordination going on in the village at the time. So it kind of it just really does demonstrate we don't see this pattern anywhere else, and we don't see this road network anywhere else to this degree. And the fact that the road they came into the porches, this is what the porch would have looked like in a couple of the houses, and the road surfaces came in like wee driveways into here. So why did nucleation happen here when everybody else was just living in one or two houses in a wee hamlet? Well, to be quite honest, we don't really know. We can just surmise that creating this village lent a new space, it gave a new space for articulating identity and communal identity that people didn't feel necessarily elsewhere. And you can kind of, you can see the way everybody's come here tonight in a lovely big Portrush community, and that's just what Corrstown provided for everybody. So even if the village grew initially and sporadically from Structure 19, it definitely took on this coherent and maintained form and identity. And so the creation of the village at Corrstown at this time, it kind of, people here were casting off the established social structure that was going on elsewhere. And they were creating new metaphors and new concepts of identity and communal identity surrounding the settlement that you just don't get elsewhere. And it's most fundamentally expressed through the nucleation and the conglomeration, the living together as a village. There's nothing in any of the material evidence that we excavated from Corrstown that makes it different from any of the other farmsteads. Everybody was kind of living and kind of the same assemblages that you find elsewhere in the dispersed settlements were found here. The main thing that makes Corrstown so unique is this nucleation and the communal living, the planned aspects to the site. So when we were excavating it at the time, it was suggested that perhaps some people had come to Portrush and they had brought this communal living with them. And at the time, there was a strong suspicion that maybe people had come from Scotland. So a lot of the houses in Corrstown had these kind of the double or the segmented ditches that went around them, and these were filled with stones. And at the time, these were really, really similar to some of the ones that you would find in Scotland. I mean, these two here, you could have just pulled that out of the Corrstown book. They basically just look exactly the same, and the dates and all were very similar. But since 2002 to 2003, we've now excavated a lot more Bronze Age settlements, and there are other ones now from across Ireland. We've got them in Antrim, Ballyprior, Ballyutoig. We've got them in Meath and down in Sligo as well, with similar traits. So we've kind of got the similar patterns. And again, there was nothing in the Corrstown material record to indicate that anybody other than an insular population lived here. So kind of the conclusion at the minute is that certainly the evidence for Scottish people coming over here and settling in Corrstown in the Bronze Age can't be substantiated. So it's also been suggested that people come to live together in communal living in villages if we have like a really overcrowded population or crowded landscape. So the distribution map that we saw earlier, it kind of suggested that maybe the particular areas were densely occupied, but there really is no evidence to suggest that in the Bronze Age we have that severe demographic pressure that would mean that people would have to come together to live together. Surely, if that was the case, we would have other nucleated settlements. We would have found something else that would have come close to Corrstown, but we don't. It could also be surmised that people come to live together for security or defensive purposes, as is kind of the thinking at a lot of the hill fort sites. But although the Corrstown houses generally kind of form a bit of an oval cluster, although it's also slightly defined by the excavation area, there's no evidence for an enclosure or a barrier, apart from the wee stream to the west, to suggest that there was anything defensive going on here. So it's probably more likely that some form of social change drove the establishment of the village here at Corrstown. And during that village phase, when we had maybe up to 300 people living in the 50 contemporary houses all together, there must have been a real vibrant sense of community and a vibrant identity dynamic. The inhabitants must have felt distinct from their contemporaries, from their neighbours up the road who lived in individual farmsteads. There's no doubt about it. And the social topography of the village would have incorporated who did belong to Corrstown, and perhaps just as importantly, who did not. We do know that there were smaller structures excavated around the periphery, notably around the eastern side here, and some of them were a lot smaller than the others. And we kind of, Stuart and I thought that maybe these were the new builds that had occurred at the edges, both geographically and perhaps also socially. So in a village context, you obviously would have had opportunities to delineate hierarchy. You might expect that there would have been expressions of social ranking between the households, but there's nothing in Corrstown. They're all, apart from structure 19, they're all the same. The material assemblage, again, between the houses is the same as well as between the different types of settlements. So the Corrstown village acted as a binding force. Certainly the built environment, it didn't maintain or exaggerate social differentiation. This really was kind of like village life, communal living. So we know that nucleation is very atypical in this period of Ireland. And whatever happened at Corrstown, it didn't provide a blueprint for other settlements, at least not that we know of yet. It didn't pave the way for further nucleation of farmsteads. So the earlier and coexisting settlement pattern, it didn't change outside Corrstown. The relative dispersal of farmsteads continued, but there was a perceptible shift in upland settlement patterns at around the same time as life at Corrstown begins to wane. And we now know that hill forts, the dating of hill forts has slightly shifted as well. I'll come on to that in a wee second. So we have undated but probably Bronze Age platforms at several other sites, Turlock Hill down south and up at Knockdhu as well. And once you start looking at the aerials for Knockdhu, you can suddenly see these like everywhere. You can kind of get a bit taken away, a bit carried away. So we have maybe up to 30 possible houses at Knockdhu. Some of these have been excavated and some of these are roughly contemporary with Corrstown. Unfortunately, we still don't have a lot of dates from these kind of upland settlement sites. But morphologically and kind of size-wise and all, they kind of look pretty similar, so we can kind of suspect they are Bronze Age. So after about 1150 BC, occupation at Corrstown began to wane, which Cormac has kind of described as the decline phase. The way in which the settlement was abandoned is unknown, and there's no conclusive evidence to suggest that any one bit of the settlement continued for much longer than anywhere else. And Middle Bronze Age settlements are generally recognised as being quite short-lived, 1 or 2 generations maybe only. But as I said there earlier, at Corrstown, we think that they were occupied for a lot longer, given the rebuilding of their massive posts. So we know that Corrstown was occupied for several hundred years. So why then did the site decline? Why was it abandoned in the end? Again, we don't really know. Perhaps whatever social force had caused everybody to come to live together was eventually kind of abandoned. it lasted just in the several successive generations at Corrstown for those generations only. So there's no evidence that any other dispersed farmsteads were abandoned in favour of this village model. We don't know, but there's no evidence to suggest that other kin groups were incentivised to kind of form other villages. And the settlement morphology at Corrstown was obviously then without widespread appeal. So whatever had caused the creation and maintenance of Corrstown, it only existed within that time frame and in this locality. So it was definitely time and place specific. Perhaps Corrstown outgrew itself and the local resources were insufficient to support its population. Or perhaps it had something to do with hill forts. So Irish hill fort construction, we now know, began to start around the same time that Corrstown began to decline. For a long time we thought hill forts were Iron Age, but we now know that they're later Bronze Age. So we've got sites with dates at Knockdhu, Rathgal, Haughey's Fort in Armagh, Muhon down in Munster. And we know that they began whenever Corrstown began to decline. So whatever socio-economic change brought about the creation and maintenance of village life at Corrstown, it obviously altered significantly. And the organisation of how people identified with settlement shifted towards the hill forts and perhaps found new ways to be created and reinforced in that sphere. So 20 years on, oh sorry, I should have shown that earlier. Too busy rabbiting away. Sure, you'll have a copy of the slides anyway. So 20 years on, Corrstown remains a bit of an enigma, and I kind of feel a bit of a fraud that I didn't really have much to add to the narrative here tonight. So whatever identity structures were in place in Corrstown, they weren't widespread. The prevailing model of individual settlements of small hamlets, it continued, it prevailed. The relative dispersal of these other sites outside of Corrstown may have afforded the inhabitants greater flexibility and a greater ability to develop and survive within every environmental, economic and social niche. There obviously remained some perceived advantage in adhering to this other settlement structure outside of Corrstown, and that's why that endured during the later Bronze Age. However, the rise of the upland fort sites, hill forts and promontory forts, can't go ignored. These other possible Bronze Age houses at enclosed sites suggest that the social and cultural changes of the late Bronze Age did still invite communal living, although perhaps on a less impressive scale than here at Corrstown. And as regional disparity in artefacts and hoard deposition continued to increase during the later Bronze Age, it's evident that the need to identify with a collective entity greater than oneself that they had experienced here in Corrstown, it was still there, it was just manifested in different ways. And this little illustration, it's a far cry from everybody else's, but we had done, way back in the day with ICS, we had done a wee education pack called Connor's Corrstown, and we had tried to distribute that to the schools, and it was kind of like just a wee, I think it was aimed at kind of like P5, P6 at the time, and it was about navigating life in the Bronze Age and in Corrstown, and we had a wee thing about how to make roundhouses. And I don't know if ACS still have it. We might well do. So if anybody is interested in that, just get in touch either with Kerri or myself, and we can kind of resurrect that as well. But that's it for me. And Kerri I'll pass over to Kerri now, and she's brought some fabulous pottery with her as well that we encourage everybody to have a good look at the end. Hopefully. Yep. So watch this space.
Okay, our second speaker this evening is Dr. Kerri Cleary, who has worked as a professional archaeologist since graduating with an MA in archaeology from University College Cork in 2002 and completing her PhD in 2007. Kerri's current employers are Archaeological Consultancy Services Unit, and she joined it in 2018 and is their editorial and research manager with responsibility for managing post-excavation research and quality across all their projects. Dr. Cleary will examine how those who lived at Corrstown might have eaten and presents results from recent scientific analysis of some of the 449 pots found during the excavation. Over to you, Kerri. Okay.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to start by reiterating what Vicky said. I am humbled to be here and utterly impressed by the setup, by the number of people who are interested in archaeology here. It's always hard to get this number of people interested, so it's really wonderful. And thank you very much for the invitation to speak. And I also want to just start by thanking Vicky for really setting the scene about what life was like in Ireland during the Bronze Age, and especially at Corrstown. And where then I want to pick up the story is in relation to the food that was actually sustaining all of those people that were living there about 3,500 years ago. So I'm going to begin by talking a little bit about what we actually know about Bronze Age food and farming in Ireland generally, and then move on to Corrstown specifically, to both what we actually learned from the excavation itself, and then from more recent scientific analysis that we undertook on some of the pottery using a technique called organic residue analysis. And that was just a small little project called What's Cooking, and this was funded by the Royal Irish Academy in 2022. And it was undertaken in conjunction with colleagues at the University of Bristol, specifically Dr. Julie Dunn and Professor Richard Evershed, who are there. And they're really leading experts in this particular technique that we use in archaeology. And I'm also going to draw a little bit on a second project that I've been involved in at University College Dublin over the last 2 years. And this was funded through the Irish Research Council. And this was looking at things like food security in the Bronze Age in Ireland. So all sorts of ties together nicely. Okay, so archaeological evidence has long indicated that the actual species of animals that were being farmed and eaten during the preceding Neolithic continued very much into the Bronze Age, with cows, cattle, pigs, sheep and goats all very important to varying degrees. And this was both for their primary products, essentially their meat, milk, bone marrow, but also very much, we think, for their secondary products, which of course don't always survive in the archaeological record, unfortunately. And this includes things like hides, wool, hair, gut, sinew, and then other things like bone and antler, of course, would survive. And these were often worked into tools and so on. Cattle, of course, we know would also have been used as draft animals at this time. And indeed, we now know quite recently that some farmers, even in the preceding Neolithic, they were actually breeding very large cattle, possibly even oxen, specifically for this purpose of being draft animals. And we also believe that the domestic horse was probably first introduced to the island during the Bronze Age, again to be used as a draft animal and for transport, and also to actually be eaten when it was necessary. And dogs were also known from this period, and they were also actually in Ireland since the preceding Neolithic. And again, there's hints that dogs, similar to the horses, may actually have been also eaten when it was required. And this is largely actually based on bones from Haughey's Fort, of course, in the Navan complex in Armagh. And there, Dr. Finbar McCormack noted that the bones of quite large-sized dogs were sort of broken and gnawed in a similar way to the bones of the cattle and the pigs. And this suggested that they were probably being consumed as food. So keep your pets inside. One site that also really fundamentally changed our understanding about what food was being eaten during the Bronze Age in Ireland is the site of Dún Aonghasa, which is, of course, on the Aran island of Inishmore, just off the coast of County Galway. And this island site was very different because, to say for all the sites that Vicky showed us on the mainland of Ireland, this site was very different because not only were sheep favoured very much over cattle here, but also the sheep and then the limited number of cattle, they were killed quite young. And this is probably because there was actually a lack of available fodder or food to actually keep them alive for any longer. And this sort of lack of resources in that sense, along with the actual location of the site itself, as you can see here on the cliff edge, it meant that actually a lot of different types of wild foods were being exploited. And so fish and birds actually contributed quite significantly to the diets of the people who were living here. And the fish bones were dominated by things like wrasse and bream, which suggests that people were sort of exploiting kind of inshore sort of rocky habitats, and they were probably fishing off the cliff edges with a hook and a long line. And they were also consuming other species like pollock, salmon, hake, cod, whiting, dogfish. So they had quite a varied diet. And the bones that were found at this site also suggested that seals were hunted occasionally, and that they may have also butchered things like sperm whales and dolphins when they became stranded. And they also consumed, as I said, birds such as guillemots and shags, as well as things, and they also ate things like limpets, periwinkles, and other sort of seafood. And they probably also collected seaweed itself. So as part of the food security in Bronze Age Ireland project that I mentioned at the beginning, we took a look in more detail at sort of 3 study areas across Ireland, one over in the west, one in sort of the Midlands, and then one up there in the northeast covering kind of Down and Armagh. And this graph here shows nearly 30,000 animal bone fragments that have been recorded to species type from across these areas. And these 30,000 or so bones or bone fragments came from 32 different sites. And as you might expect, cattle very much dominates, and this is followed here by sheep, goat, which of course we often group because their bones, especially when we only find little fragments, are very difficult to actually distinguish. And then also you can see the sheep, goat are followed by fish and then pig. However, the prominence of fish in this graph is actually very misleading because essentially all of that, nearly all of it, comes from that site at Dúnaingasa. So if we actually take out the Dúnaingasa site, we see a slightly different picture, and then we still see that cattle very much does dominate, but this time it's followed actually by pig and then sheep, goat. And fish, which is sort of highlighted in green, is actually found in very small numbers outside of Dúnaingasa. So it's quite rare to actually get fish bone on an archaeological site in the Bronze Age. And there were also some very small hints at other things like deer, horse, bird, duck, hare, wildcat, fox, boar, and rodents. So regarding the actual cultivated crops then, we know that they were using, or mainly farming, 3 in the Bronze Age, barley, wheat and flax, although flax is quite rare. Oat and rye also do appear in the archaeological record for this time period, but they are probably, we think, just still weeds at this stage and not actually being grown specifically as crops. So research also suggests that wheat, specifically emmer wheat, but also bread and spelt wheat, has been found to sort of dominate at some sites, while other places were much more reliant on barley, specifically naked barley, but also hulled barley. And of course, naked barley is often seen as being favourable for making things like bread, because of course with no hull it's much easier to actually grind it into flour, while hulled barley then is seen to be more favourable for using in things like kind of porridge-like dishes. And if we compare 2 of the counties, Tipperary and Galway, that we used within that project, we can see that barley very much sort of dominates in both areas, but it's actually followed quite closely by wheat. However, if we sort of take a look at these assemblages a little bit closer again, and we look at where there was more than 50 grains actually found, then we can see that barley actually does largely dominate. And this is very much what we believe is the case in the Bronze Age, that barley became, as the Bronze Age moved on, much more common for farmers to be growing barley. Other seeds, fruits and nuts were probably also being gathered and eaten during this period. And indeed, charred hazelnut shells are frequently encountered on archaeological sites. And while some of these may, of course, just reflect the wood that was actually being gathered and burnt at the site, others do appear to actually represent food remains. And a nice example of this is actually, again, Haughey's Fort, where a very large pit was found to contain charred hazelnut shell fragments mixed with charred barley grains. And this was interpreted as a sort of a muesli processing area. An examination of the hazelnut shell fragments suggested that there could have been up to nearly 1,800 hazelnuts. So quite a lot to gather. So if we move on to Corrstown itself then, of course its position close to the coast, but also to the River Bann and not far from the Foyle and the Bush, would suggest that the people that lived here probably exploited both saltwater and freshwater fish. Of course, it's all suggested that there may have been sort of salt marsh in the area. And of course, this could have also been home to many different species of animals, specifically things like wading birds and waterfowl. The site, of course, also sat on relatively dry, well-drained soil. And indeed, the surrounding lands were used for pasture, as far as I'm aware, throughout the sort of 18th and 19th centuries. So it probably had a similar use in the distant past. Charred wood that was found during the excavations also suggested that things like alder and hazel trees must have grown quite nearby, with alder probably being used for building many of the structures, as well as things like handles for stone and metal tools, that sort of thing, while hazel is often associated with managed oak woodlands. So they were probably used for things like wattle of houses, for the roofs. And they would have also, of course, these types of woodlands would have also been very much rich in other resources also, including the hazelnuts, but probably also were home to animals like red deer, wild cat and boar. And of course, traditionally, pigs are also kept near forested areas so that they could naturally forage for food. Now, unfortunately, direct evidence for farming practices and food was very limited at Corrstown for a number of reasons. But one of them is the acidity level in the soil, which was not favourable to the survival of animal bones. And this is actually not unusual across Ireland. We have this problem with a lot of prehistoric sites where the animal bone doesn't survive or doesn't survive very well. And also at Corrstown, very few of the houses actually had evidence for hearths or fireplaces. And these would be places where we might expect to actually recover the burnt food remains often, such as burnt cereal grains. But without those hearths, then very little survived. And this lack of evidence for sort of internal fireplaces within houses is actually, again, not that unusual for Bronze Age Ireland. However, it's been suggested that some of them may have actually been sort of raised off the floors, and therefore that's why very little hearths actually survive in the archaeological record. And this is something that has come up recently and suggested for this late Bronze Age settlement site of Must Farm in the Cambridgeshire Fens. Some of you might be familiar with it. It's sort of referred to as the Bronze Age Pompeii. And this was, of course, exceptionally well preserved because the whole settlement there was a catastrophic fire, so the whole settlement was really unbelievably well preserved. So it's really changing a lot of our ideas about Bronze Age settlement and houses. But they also had an issue where there was very few or no evidence really for internal hearths or fireplaces within the houses. So they suggested that they were probably suspended up off the floors, largely probably to keep them sort of dry on these sort of clay-built plates or boxes. So perhaps something similar was used at Corrstown, where the hearths were raised. And in terms of the food remains at Corrstown, a very small burnt bone was recovered, but it was really too small to identify it to species, except for one little fragment, which is suggested to be from a large mammal foot bone. A very small quantity of charred cereal grain was also recovered, and this hinted at a sort of dominance of barley, specifically naked barley, and again a small number of wheat grains and a single grain of rye. So this is very much reflective, again, of the sort of general pattern of Bronze Age sites across Ireland. And one thing, of course, that was found in abundance at Corrstown was the pottery. And over 9,000 fragments or sherds representing nearly 500 vessels were found during the excavation. And of these, around 480 of the pots could be identified as dating from the time that the settlement was in use. And this represents the largest assemblage of pottery so far that's ever been recovered from a single Bronze Age settlement in either Ireland or Britain. So it's really an absolutely phenomenal collection of pottery. And then of these, about 450 or so of the vessels can be directly linked to individual roundhouses. And the number of pots that was found in each house varied quite a lot. So you had from as little as maybe one little fragment representing one vessel in structure 34, and then to over 700 fragments of pottery representing about 38 pots from structure 4. And because of this really large collection of pottery, I felt that another way that we could actually get at understanding the types of food that was being produced and consumed at the site was to use this technique called organic residue analysis. And this analysis, as I said, was carried out at the School of Chemistry at the University of Bristol. And while I'm not going to go into the details on it, I'll just say that it essentially involves testing those small fragments that have been broken off pots for absorbed organic molecules, which are called lipids. And these represent things like fats, oils, waxes, and resins. And they largely originate from whatever was stored or cooked in the pots. So the technique is used to detect a range of commodities then, and in the context of Ireland and Britain, it's usually terrestrial animal fats, marine animal fats, plant waxes, and beeswax. And then with regard to the animal fats, analysis of the carbon-13 values can then allow us to distinguish between basically milk fatty acids and carcass fats, so the difference between sort of milk products and meat products. And when undertaking this type of analysis, we also have to think quite carefully about the actual life cycles of the pots that we're testing. And we have to think about how they may have been used during that time, how some uses may not leave strong enough residues for us to detect with this method, particularly if a pot is used or reused for different things over its lifetime, storing one thing and then another thing. So essentially, this technique is useful in detecting what the pot was used for most dominantly throughout its lifetime. So before I move on then, I'm just going to say a little something about the pottery itself. It's analysed by specialists Dr. Owen Grogan and Helen Roach, and they suggest it fall into a type what we call domestic cordoned urn. And these are largely sort of undecorated bucket or barrel shaped pots, and indeed those at Corrstown were fundamental actually in changing our understanding of this type of pottery in Ireland. And the Corrstown excavation pushed the date of these pots right back to emerging at about 1500 BC. So it's really one of the most important collections in Ireland. And while most of the pots are undecorated, a small number have things like applied cords. And these are essentially sort of little strips of clay that are pressed onto the exterior of the pot just for a type of decoration. And you can see an example sort of up at the top here, although this one isn't from Corrstown. Other pots had little incised lines with sort of chevron and triangle decorations, and others had shallow grooves, sometimes in pairs, just underneath the rims. And just over 50 of the pots had sort of horizontal grooves. You can see an example of the one here in the middle. And it's possible that these could have been used to help sort of secure lids or coverings over the tops of the pots. And it's also notable that carbonized residues, which is essentially the burnt-on remains of food, is visible on both the inside and the outside of many of the pots, suggesting that they were used for a long time for cooking. And hopefully at the end you can kind of come up and take a look at some of the examples that I brought. Sorry for the people who are online that don't get to see them, but we have some sort of large bases, small bases, which give you a sort of a sense of the different size of the pots. We have some of the rims, so you can see these incised lines. We have a lovely example with some fingernail impressions of the person who actually made the pot, another with a lovely leaf impression, which they obviously was. So you can take a look at the end. So to do the analysis then, we selected a small amount. We chose fragments from 40 different pots from 28 different structures across the site. And these were to reflect pots from all the different types of houses that were excavated at Corrstown, as well as to represent the different types of pots that were found, the different sizes, sort of large, medium and small, and those that had sort of indentations or perforations or different distinguishing features. And if we look at the sherds themselves, we also tried to pick a sort of selection from those that had carbonised residues, those that just had sort of blackened exteriors or interiors, and those that had no evidence for any residues or blackening. So the results then, well, we were actually delighted that we had an 80% success rate, which is very high in this type of technique. And this means that 32 of the 40 pots had organic residues. And of the 8 little pots that didn't have anything in particular, one was kind of interesting. And this pot, which is this little fragment from structure 9, it had this, hopefully you can kind of see here, it had this visible burnt on residue. So we were quite surprised that it gave us no reading, because we actually tested the burnt on residue as well and still nothing. And this, for it to fail in this way, is actually very unusual, because this burnt on residue generally represents fat, and so it's usually quite concentrated fat. So it's been suggested that possibly this vessel was only maybe used once or on very few occasions. And it is perhaps notable that it was recovered from structure 9. And this is one of sort of 2 of the structures that produced dates towards the end of the Middle Bronze Age into the Late Bronze Age, and therefore kind of date to that time that Vicky mentioned, where the site was actually in decline. So it's possible that this vessel represents some of the sort of last days of the site before it was essentially abandoned. And then moving on to the 32 sherds that did contain residues, all of the lipid profiles were sort of what we call typical degraded animal fats. And that's represented here by the high carbon 16 and 18 readings that you can see. And the next step then was to determine what these major fatty acids represented. So we plotted them against sort of reference animal fats. And the first being what we call ruminant dairy, which of course in the case of the Irish Bronze Age is likely to be cow, sheep and goat. And the second being ruminant adipose, and adipose essentially means the fat that's underneath the skin. So in that sense it's just suggestive of meat or carcass from, again, probably cattle, sheep and goats. And the third then is non-ruminant adipose, which in the context of Irish Bronze Age is most likely a pig or potentially wild boar. So when these results are plotted, you can see in the middle, hopefully, that the vast majority, just over 70% of the vessels, the pots, plotted very much within that area of milk or milk-related food. So quite a high percentage were just being used for that. 16%, or about 5 pots, were plotted within the ruminant adipose region, which is that meat area, and another 2 within non-ruminant adipose. So these are basically linked to meat from different types of animals. And then the remaining 2 pots plotted sort of between adipose and dairy regions. And this suggests kind of either perhaps mixing of animal fats during the same process. So for example, if you were cooking meat in like butter or milk, or maybe the vessel itself was being used for different things over its lifetime. So if we take a closer look at those 23 pots for the dairy products, we can see that they were probably, we can say they're probably used to store milk, but it's also quite possible that many of them were being used to process the milk into things like butter and cheese, perhaps even yogurt and fermented drinks like kefir. And these pots, as you can see, they actually came from all different structures across the site. So there's no differentiation between the structures and the types of food that they were using. And this one here from structure 5 had a very, very high percentage, highest percentage of all those tested, which suggests that this pot was definitely being used for a long, long time to store or process milk. And this dominance of dairy is very much in line with other studies that have been conducted, both for the Irish Neolithic, but also on Bronze Age settlements in southern Britain. And their colleagues, Dr. Mark Copley, they found that nearly 90% of over 250 vessels actually had dairy products. So the Bronze Age people really, really liked their milk. And this, of course, is not sort of overly surprising in many ways, because prehistoric people must have had issues when it came to storing milk that was being produced by their livestock. Of course, we know that when it was fresh milk, if it was placed into these vessels, then they probably could have sort of skimmed off the fat or the cream that rose to the top, and that again would have been used in things like cooking, but also possibly sealing some of the vessels as well. So milk was just an everyday thing. And this sort of one of the uses of milk is kind of nicely demonstrated by a couple of years ago by colleagues, Professor Penny Bickle and Dr. Susan Greeny, where they basically proved that milk could be heated in these vessels, and following the addition of rennet, which is of course naturally produced in the stomach of ruminant animals, and that this could have led to the production of curds and whey. And the curds, of course, could then be sort of separated off to make a kind of cottage cheese type product. And then they could have used the whey in baking things like bread, soaking legumes, and perhaps even as a kind of a nutritious enough drink. And then, as I mentioned earlier, about 5 of the pots plotted within that ruminant adipose region. So again, suggesting the processing of meat, cattle, cows, sheep, goat. So these ones were again spread across the site with no real distinction between what types of structures. Interestingly, there was also no distinction between the types of pots that they seem to have been using for this. For example, you see here, this one from structure 3, this was a very large pot with a sort of a perforation or a small hole just below the rim, which potentially could have been used to leave out steam if these were used for sort of cooking or stewing. While that from structure 58 down the bottom, this was a much smaller vessel, and this included one of those sort of horizontal lines around the end of the rim. So again, possibly was covered for storage or for cooking. Another 2 vessels plotted within that non-ruminant adipose carcass region. So again, this probably suggests something like pig or boar, and they might have been mixed with sort of minor carcass products from other animals as well. Both of these pots are actually very large pots, and again, might suggest something like sort of large cooking or stewing pots. And it's interesting that actually, even though we don't necessarily have size distinctions between what the pots were being used for at Corrstown, we do see it at other sites, like some of the southern British ones, for example. The animal fats for the carcasses were very much in large kind of jar-like pots, and they were very much being used to cook meat, while the dairy fats were just usually kept in sort of smaller bowls. So where does that really leave us then? Regarding those at Corrstown and what they were eating. Well, we know that they had access to barley, but probably also wheat and rye, as well as hazelnuts, probably also a range of other wild fruits, nuts and berries. We can now confirm for definite from the pottery results that they had access to both ruminant and non-ruminant animals. So based on other sites across Ireland and Britain, we know this is probably cows and cattle being dominant, but also sheep, goat and pigs, potentially wild boar. And this means, of course, then that we're also missing an awful lot of animals, not least of all the fish and the birds. But if we look back at the site of Dunangus, we have to imagine that the people living at Corrstown must also have been fishing and scavenging marine resources, as well as the sort of freshwater species that were right on their doorstep. And if we look back again at the Must Farm excavations, we can see, for example, evidence for Bronze Age fish weirs, as you can see at the top right here, and willow basket traps. And these were Middle Bronze Age in date, so roughly contemporary with Corrstown. And they could have used these to catch things like eels and small fish. They also have evidence there for things like knotted net and associated line sinkers made out of ceramic. And the range of vessels from Must Farm, both ceramic and wooden, also gives us really great insights into how people used these everyday containers for storing, processing and cooking food, but also for actually eating out of the vessels, which is something that we maybe don't always think of too much. And because of the fire at Must Farm, some of the pots actually survived containing evidence of the meals that and also sort of food being processed. For example, in the bottom right, you can see here, this is sort of the remains of a thick porridge-like mix of sort of roughly ground wheat meal that was mixed with animal fats, and that's been tested to be probably sheep, goat or red deer. And this sort of bowl of porridge essentially was found with the spoon still in it. So it's really quite beautiful. And then you can see up in the top left, this is an example where they may have actually been starting a brewing mash. And this is basically a lot of chaff mixed with intact grains of barley and wheat, and also beeswax lipids, which is being interpreted as representing honey. So potentially, basically, they were starting the very beginning of a new beer brew. So before I finish up then, I just want to take a closer look. Before I finish up and you can maybe have a look at the pottery, I just want to end by mentioning that along with all of that pottery that was found at the site, there's also a very large assemblage of worked flint from Corrstown, as Vicky also mentioned. As well as several things like small stone axes, including this little lovely miniature stone axe head and a mace head. And accordingly, while many of these stone tools were probably used essentially in building the houses, cutting down the firewood, that sort of thing, many others could have actually been involved very much in the butchery of the animal carcasses and the preparation of the food generally. So I'm kind of delighted to announce that myself and a colleague who's a stone tool expert, Cian Hogan, we recently secured some funding through the Department of Communities Historic Environment Fund to do a little bit more work on the Corrstown lithics. And this is a project called Working Stone in the Bronze Age, Corrstown as a national case study. So again, reiterating the importance of Corrstown nationally. And as part of that project, we're going to have a look at these stone tools to see what some of them could potentially have been used for. And hopefully, if you'll have me back, I'd love to come maybe next year and do maybe a little workshop with you on using stone tools in the Bronze Age, hopefully. So watch this space.